Jonathan McReynolds, 35, entered that stage anticipating a typical worship night. However, witnesses said that something inside of him finally shattered the moment the light struck his face. He ceased to sing. He took a step back. Jonathan McReynolds broke down in tears in front of thousands of people, sharing a reality he had been keeping to himself for years. The most unexpected element was that what he ultimately admitted wasn't what anybody had anticipated. This revelation shocked his supporters, rocked the gospel world, and made even his closest friends wonder, how long has he been hiding this? Jonathan McReynolds has been referred to be the quiet storm of gospel music for many years. A voice that many thought nothing could shake because it was so clean, so in control, and so spiritually anchored. However, there was a personal struggle going on behind the perfect vocals, the accolades, the sold-out shows, and the motivational songs, a struggle he never wanted to make public. We're looking beyond the news headlines, the web videos, and the gossip that circulated following that dramatic collapse tonight. Because Jonathan's actual experience at age 35 is more than a single incident, this is a pivotal moment. A confession that reveals the emotional toll of being the ideal gospel performer in a society that demands perfection, the pressure of celebrity, and the invisible burden of ministry. You're going to learn the true reason he lost it that evening, the secret battle he at last acknowledged, and the reality that silenced everyone in the room. You won't believe what transpired next, I promise. With a full auditorium, perfect acoustics, and a congregation eager to worship, it was meant to be a celebration. Hundreds of times, Jonathan has played in places like this. However, others who were present that evening claim that something seemed different as soon as he took the stage. He appeared to be forced to smile. His voice was quieter, almost unsteady. Jonathan McReynolds also appeared worn out for the first time in his career. Emotionally fatigued, not physically. He tried to begin his introductory song after greeting the audience and adjusting the microphone. However, he froze midway through the first verse. His gaze strayed up as though he was looking for words that would not come. Then his hands started shaking. The band gave him a perplexed look. Jonathan stood there fighting a storm that no one else could see while the crowd waited in silence. He moved away from the microphone a few seconds later, slowly, as if something inside of him had finally crumbled, but not dramatically or with theatrics. Then came the turning point in the story. Jonathan lowered his head, covered his face, and started to cry. It was a complete, overwhelming outburst, not quiet weeping or a gradual emotional collapse, the sort that says to the world, I can't carry this anymore, and that you can't conceal. Uncertain of what they were seeing, the audience gasped. Some prayed and others took notes. The room fell silent as Jonathan finally uttered the words that had been gnawing at his heart for months. What most shocked everyone, though, was what he said next. Jonathan was standing on that stage, his hands shaking as he wiped his face. The crowd held their breath. No one was aware of what was taking place. Not his squad, not the music, not even his best friends who had accompanied him on the journey that evening. There was a heavy, almost hallowed silence in the room, as though everyone knew deep down that they were seeing something much more profound than a mere emotional moment. At last, Jonathan raised his head. He took a big breath and spoke, albeit his voice was shaky and his eyes were burning. I know y'all came to hear me sing tonight, he remarked, his voice barely audible above that. Just hearing the words, but I can't pretend anymore, sent shockwaves through the room. Jonathan had always been reserved, self-controlled, contemplative, and cautious with his feelings. He was the most cohesive, unwavering, and grounded of all the gospel performers. When he said, I can't pretend anymore, it seemed as though something fundamental was breaking. He hesitated once more, as though he was determining how much of his reality he was at last prepared to share. I've been pouring out more than I've had for a long time, he added, breathing shakily. Some people in the crowd nodded. I've been giving, singing, and encouraging while fighting battles I didn't want anyone to see. Others prayed for him in silence while closing their eyes. Even yet, nobody was ready for his next admission. Jonathan stepped forward, clutching the microphone stand as though it were his only support. On certain days, I've wondered what my purpose is. I've been dealing with something that has been silently breaking me down, something I believed I could do alone, and there have been days when I've wondered if I can continue doing this." Tears fell again. The musicians put down their instruments. The security guards ceased to move as well. Everyone believed that what he was going to say would permanently alter how they perceived him. When all the walls were eventually brought down, Jonathan finally disclosed the information he had been keeping for years. The battle he had concealed behind accolades, appearances, and flawlessly produced CDs. And the whole mood changed when he finally said those words. A few folks let out a loud gasp. A few grabbed their companions. Some in the rear joined him in tears. However, there was more to this confession than meets the eye. It was really only the beginning. Because the true cause of Jonathan's emotional collapse at the age of 35, which drove him to this breaking point, extends much beyond that particular evening. It all stems from pressure, expectations, personal setbacks, and a long simmering inner anguish. You had to go all the way back to the years when Jonathan McReynolds' career was taking off more quickly than anyone could have predicted in order to comprehend why he broke down at the age of 35. Few people were aware of the mental and emotional strain that was developing behind the scenes, despite the fact that fans saw a rising gospel singer with a smooth voice, beautiful writing, and a humble personality. Jonathan didn't have a family that encouraged him to become well-known. He didn't pursue fame as a child. Everything that came his way, the accolades, the fame, the worldwide following, came swiftly, fiercely, and with a burden he never requested. When he was still young, churches started constantly scheduling him. When millions began turning to him for answers, he was still developing his spiritual identity. And that turned into the silent burden, because you suddenly don't feel like you can break when your songs help people, when your words reassure strangers, or when your voice becomes a lifeline for someone else. People tend to forget that you are human. Years before anyone noticed, Jonathan began to feel the fissures in private. According to close acquaintances, there were times when he returned from concerts with a heavy silence, the kind that indicates someone is carrying a lot more than they are expressing. He was privileged and thankful, no doubt, but he was also emotionally strained in ways that were never made public. Then came the pressure to be flawless, the comparisons, and the expectations. Each new record had to be more profound than the one before it. Each performance needed to be perfect. Even when he didn't feel strong, every song had to convey spiritual strength. In an interview, he once acknowledged that being a gospel performer is both lovely and burdensome. Poetry wasn't what that was. That was the reality. Because errors are more than just errors in the gospel world. Like, they turn into discussions, assessments, and arguments. Jonathan was also aware that all he had worked so hard to create may be destroyed by one mistake. Few people were aware that he was only revealing the parts he could handle in public, despite the fact that many appreciated his sensitivity in his songs. Until they were no longer able to. The true suffering, the more profound anxieties, and the struggles he faced alone were kept hidden. Then he had a personal loss that rocked him in unexpected ways. He never gave a public explanation for his quiet sadness. According to friends, this was the point at which his emotional stability started to deteriorate. Slowly, through restless nights, emotional exhaustion, and an increasing realization that he was living for everyone but himself, rather than abruptly or spectacularly. When you add in the pressure to be strong for other people, the continual travel, and spiritual expectations, Jonathan was exhausted by the age of 35. That night, his collapse didn't start on stage. It started years ago in the quiet, private times when he persuaded himself, "I'll deal with this later," but later never materialized. Even so, it wasn't the whole tale, because there was still one more significant turning point, a private incident that tipped Jonathan over the edge emotionally and made him rethink everything: his identity, his religion, his mission, and the perception that the outside world held of him. The weight of the pressure Jonathan had been carrying in silence had increased to the point where it was affecting everything by the time he turned 35. His relationships, his inventiveness, his sense of purpose, and even his faith. However, nobody was aware that the months preceding that emotional collapse were more than just challenging. He had never experienced such darkness in his life. It began in silence. Initially, Jonathan started to back out of minor commitments, not because he didn't care, but rather because he was exhausted in ways he couldn't describe. His pals assumed he was simply worn out from the journey. Those closest to him later acknowledged that something about him seemed strange, despite his team's assumption that he needed to rest. It was the way his once bright, contemplative eyes began to fade, the way he moved more slowly, and the way he took longer to react. Then the time arrived when everything changed. More than any public rumor, industry pressure, or career obstacle, Jonathan was rocked by the news, deeply personal news. Few individuals are fully aware of what it was. However, according to insiders, it featured a person he had a great deal of faith in, and who had been a silent rock in his life. The kind of betrayal or loss that goes beyond simple pain. Something inside of you is broken. It wasn't simply emotional. It hit at the very core of his identity. From that day on, Jonathan wasn't the same. He stopped writing the way he used to. He stopped talking about future plans. He ceased to act as though nothing was wrong. Furthermore, he finally started to feel the consequences of being the stronger one. People expected him to cheer them up, to sing them through their hardships, to elevate their spirits wherever he went. However, nobody realized how much he needed someone to do it for him. There were nights when he sat by himself at his piano behind closed doors, trying to calm his own thoughts rather than compose music. There were nights when he prayed for relief, not for direction or success. There were evenings when he questioned whether the only way to breathe again would be to completely remove himself from the spotlight. The emotional spiral followed. Self-doubt became ingrained. More than ever, fatigue struck. The pressure to maintain appearances became oppressive. He didn't lose faith exactly. It was that, in front of everyone, he had no idea how to keep things together. And that led to a sort of internal conflict for which there is no preparation. Jonathan made an effort to gather himself as the concert date drew near. He practiced. He said a prayer. He assured himself that he could survive the night. However, something was already quietly, silently, and uncontrollably falling apart inside of him. He was on emotional fumes by the time he stepped onto that stage. He wore a mask for his smile. His self-assurance seemed strained, and each step felt more burdensome than the one before it. Everyone witnessed his breakdown. The months of suffering that preceded it were invisible. However, his onstage admission that evening was about more than just stress, heartache, or fatigue. It was about something more profound, a spiritual awakening that made him face realities he had been putting off for far too long. The room seemed to stop as Jonathan eventually regained his composure on that stage. Not a cough, not a whisper, not a rustle from the throng. The silence was the kind that only occurs when thousands of people are experiencing the same thing at the same time. Fear, astonishment, and an intense interest in what he would say. Jonathan used two hands to hold the microphone because he required the support, not for show. His voice took on a brittle steadiness, the kind that comes from someone who has been suppressing the truth for too long, but his breathing slowed and his tears continued. I've been so afraid of disappointing people that I forgot how to be honest with myself, he stated after taking a deep breath. Emotional tension increased as the crowd moved a little. A ripple went through the crowd as Jonathan went on. I've carried this image, this idea of perfection for so long. People look at me like I'm supposed to have it all together, but the truth is, I've been struggling spiritually, mentally, emotionally. While some supporters bowed their heads, others prayed in quiet tones. This was not your average celebrity breakup. This man acknowledged that the amount of information he could conceal had reached its limit. The hush was finally broken by his next remarks. I've been afraid all my life. Fear of not succeeding. Fear of inadequacy. Fear that people wouldn't like me if they realized who I really am, the person behind the tunes. That statement was shocking for someone in the gospel music industry, where a career is frequently defined by one's reputation, spirituality, and public opinion. He was not discussing a scandal. He wasn't admitting to a secret transgression. He was exposing something far more human, the fear of not being the person the society expects of oneself, a dread that many artists experience but hardly acknowledge. He wasn't finished though. Jonathan inhaled deeply, causing his whole body to tremble. "I've wondered for months if I'm losing myself," he remarked. Or if I've already lost myself, and I didn't want anyone to know." That statement immediately made sense, and it shook the room like a wave. The waning flame, the silent retreat, the faint fissures in his public persona. There was no vulnerability in this moment. It was an honest moment. Jonathan's voice suddenly became much softer, nearly to a whisper. Singing no longer seemed liberating to me at one time. It was like being under pressure. It didn't feel like a calling to ministry. It was like anticipation. And since everyone thinks I'm the strong one, I wasn't sure who to talk to about it. He stopped, staring out at the crowd, as if he was waiting for someone who actually understood. He went on to say that understanding that prosperity does not shield one from suffering is the most difficult aspect. It simply conceals it better. Fans who had always viewed him as the epitome of emotional maturity and spiritual stability found those remarks particularly poignant. But now he appeared more human than ever, standing before them, quivering and vulnerable. Then Jonathan disclosed something even more profound, which clarified why he was on the verge of breaking during this specific stage of his life. "I began to feel estranged from God, and I was scared of that. I was reluctant to acknowledge it. Although I didn't want to admit it aloud, I felt hollow as I urged everyone else to have faith, hope, and perseverance. I didn't know how to stop feeling like a hypocrite." The chamber resonated with a collective gasp. It was more than simply emotional fatigue. The knowledge that the very calling he had based his life around was slipping from his grasp caused him to experience an identity crisis and a spiritual agony. The audience started crying with him. They understood the anguish of losing a connection to something you once loved profoundly, not out of sympathy. Jonathan dropped his head once more and was silent for a long time. He looked up at last, and his face was a mixture of vulnerability, relief, and an odd sort of calm. "Tonight," he continued quietly, "I stopped pretending. Tonight, I'm choosing honesty over perfection." Just when everyone in the room thought Jonathan had finished his confession, he leaned into the microphone and disclosed the most surprising aspect of his emotional breakdown, the pivotal moment that will eventually change his life's whole course. But only after he took a deep breath and found the guts to say words he had never said before would he have that revelation, the one that shocked the gospel industry, the one that explained the true cause of his weeping, the one that made headlines.